What's up, guys? Hope you're feeling alive right now. I'm Micah Keneally, and I want to welcome you to Young Adults Today podcast, where we talk about reaching young adults in our world today. And like always, I'm joined with my husband and co-host, Josiah. Josiah, how you doing?
I'm doing great, and this is so fun to host this show with you.
I know you just guzzled your first cup of coffee for the day, so he has a smile on his face like always. The sun is shining here in Minnesota. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord. And we also have an incredible guest who is joining us as well.
I'll introduce him in just a second, but we just want to say welcome to Pastor Rod Carlson. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I agree. The sun's out here in Minnesota, so it's really nice.
Well, for those of you who might not have been acquainted yet, Pastor Rod Carlson and his wife Melody are the senior pastors at Oak Hills Church in Eagan, Minnesota. The crazy thing is they planted this church 30 years ago at the time of recording this episode. Pastor Rod is our pastor. He's been a mentor to me for a number of years. We've had a lot of, like I mentioned, cups of coffee. I know that our guest this morning is cheersing to a cup of coffee, and Pastor Rod has his doctorate degree, focused his dissertation efforts on preaching to the unchurched. So we really want to dive into a couple of his sweet spots, which are preaching to the unchurched, and also church planting. And really excited. But Pastor Rod, could you just maybe for the guest, the listener, would you be willing to share some of your story of life, journey of leadership, faith, and marriage and ministry with us today?
So Josiah, you mentioned church plant, that we planted the church. I grew up in a church plant. Just a few years before I was born, my parents joined in a church plant called Bloomington Assembly of God Church with a pastor named R.V. Kingsrider. So I was born into that. I think it was kind of in my blood. I didn't know it that much until really we started a church. But like a lot of kids, thankfully my parents were real Christians, so they lived their faith at home. So that's the main thing. But I also had a really great church and pastor and had that experience. So like a lot of kids, I gave my life to Christ sincerely and authentically at a very young age. And at a young age, felt the call into ministry, ended up at North Central University here in Minneapolis. And at age 20, was off into ministry. And I spent the first 15 years in full-time ministry, working with youth and young adults, which some of the finest memories that I have. And I still smile. I just again received an email from Jennifer, who was part of one of our groups years ago, and it's always fun to get those. And finally, you ask about leadership. And of course, all of this is my wife, Melody, and I, who we did this together. But I not only grew up under a great pastor, but I served under three really excellent leaders in three different churches. And so in terms of leadership, past my parents, I would say that those pastors impacted my leadership attitude and mentality, and I'm really thankful for those mentors in my life.
That's amazing, Pastor Rod. I know our paths crossed before I can even remember it, because I can relate with what you just said, and maybe the listener can too. Some of my earliest memories, like my parents met at Bloomington Assembly of God. And then about a year into Oak Hills Church, they joined the church plant that you and Melody launched and pastored.
Yep, that's right.
So some of my earliest memories, I always tell you this, but I would sneak out of Space Cubs, the kids ministry, and I would go to where the saxophone was playing in church. And I had never heard a saxophone before. It was part of worship, and met in a school. And it was just like I ended up playing the saxophone later in life because I remember that memory marked me. And all that to say, like, I think that church planting is something that we want to pick your brain about and go just maybe one layer deeper about. And Mikey, you have some questions about that.
Yeah, so I would just ask you, Pastor Rod, I know that you're passionate about reaching the unchurched and you're passionate about church planting, obviously, because you've done it. But what initially spurred on that planting of the church with you and your wife almost 30 years ago?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to 1989. Melody and I were in in Orlando, Florida. We were at a very large church. At that time was large, 5,000. Now it's, I don't know, I think that's medium size now. But anyway, we were working with young adults and loved it. However, the Lord was kind of speaking to our hearts about the church, about the church becoming so big with so many programs, and it seemed like it was just Christians who were there, and I don't want to make any judgments. This was happening in me. Did I know any unchurched people? It was like we had in that church like a list of Christian business people and different places, and we'd hand that out every year. And I remember thinking, I wonder if we should be going to non-Christian business people and those kinds of things. And this was happening in our heart. One of my leaders came up to me and handed me a book. It was called, it was by Wayne Jacobson, and it was called The Naked Church. He was a pastor. And it's still in print, believe it or not. But anyway, he handed this to me and said, "Hey, Pastor Rod, read this. This thing really had an impact on my life." And the title comes from, that Hans Christian Andersen story of The Emperor Has No Clothes. And so somebody convinced him, two swindlers came in, convinced him that they were going to make the most beautiful, and only cool people could see the clothes. And so nobody wanted to say that they didn't see him without any clothes on. Until one day he's parading through town and a little kid said, "The emperor has no clothes." And so
Wow.
he was kind of using this to say, I think we need to say maybe the church has no clothes. We got to just admit we're missing it. And this really spoke to me. And I think, churches go through this time again and again. This isn't anything new, but I think for me, it was a call to start a church that, was with the unchurched in mind more, at least more strategically with the unchurched in mind. And that really got a hold of my heart. And it was right about that time that, oh, you guys, sorry. That was upstairs. They just turned on the, not Siri, but Alexa. And one of them is in my office here. So anyway.
I can edit that part out. I'll just clap for a reminder.
So anyway, we got a call at that time, and it was a call to come back to this church that my parents had helped to start. And it was this request: would you want to move back home to Minnesota? Would you want to start a church? We want to start a church in Eagan, Minnesota. And of course, our hearts, we prayed about that and came, and that passion for the unchurched was deep in our heart.
It's amazing. And clearly, like, one of the things that I think God gives leaders is they can maybe see things prophetically in advance. Like, they get a picture of the future of what could be, maybe what they feel should be. And it's called vision, of just like what they see and what they believe in their heart is the direction to lead people in. And that's so important, shepherding people and pastoring. And so can you just talk for a second about maybe the vision of, I know you referenced it, but what would you say to someone who asks, what's the vision of Oak Hills Church?
So many of your listeners are familiar with Willow Creek Church. And Willow Creek had a mission statement that we stole, but we asked permission and they said we could use it. So we exist to turn unchurched people into fully devoted followers of Christ. I've talked about that over the years so many times, and I won't talk about it, but really the two key things are unchurched. And of course, we know there are unchurched people who are Christians, and we know there are Christians who go to church. But right. I wanted to keep that in front of us because we so easily, I think, forget about the people that drive by all the time and just don't give a rip about what's happening in our churches. And so I wanted to keep that. And then fully devoted is the other part, which is, okay, so, and it's like one time somebody was talking to Bill Hybels, and they said, "Mr. Hybels, it sounds like you're trying to turn atheists into missionaries." And he said, "That's exactly what we're trying to do." And you know what? You guys know this. That is one of the hardest things to do. But anyway, so that's the vision. Lately, I've been using the word outsider more. In Luke chapter 5, of course, I learned from the early times at Willow Creek that really influenced us in trying to reach the unchurched. But in Luke 5, Matthew's having this party, and all the religious people are saying, why are you having a party with all these tax collectors and sinners? And in Eugene Peterson's version, Jesus says, well, who needs a doctor, but he says, I've come to reach the outsider, not the insider.
Mhm.
And I would say that really is our passion. I will tell you, it's been really difficult to try to reach those folks for a number of reasons. But the big picture of the last 29 years that I've tried to say is, let's not forget the outsider.
Right.
And let's try to at least strategically think about them and not ignore them. So that's, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we know that you're also passionate about seeing the different generations in the church. Like you were leading youth and young adults. You've led an entire church for almost 30 years. So you're seeing different ages from the first day they're born to maybe the last breath of some of the members that have been attending your church. And we know the brevity of life is important. We know that every age group is important.
Right.
And if there's still breath in your lungs, like you still have something to offer. So Pastor Rod, I would just ask you, can you just talk about your thoughts about the importance of involving the next generation in the church? And I think so many of our listeners hear this of like, oh, the next generation is, they're the ones that are going to be next in charge. And it's like, well, they're kind of not, they're the next generation, quote unquote, but they're also the now generation. How would you say that is important? And you just expound upon that for a minute.
So I'm going to reference a guy that probably everybody knows, Timothy Keller. And I recently was watching, I don't know what, I'm 64, so I need to know these names, but I think it was a podcast or something. I was watching it. Anyway, he was being interviewed, and he started a church, of course, in Manhattan, and had really effective to unchurched people. But he said, he was talking about, and I'm going to get back to your question, Micah, but I just want to reference this. So he talked about how there are four kind of pillars. I'm paraphrasing what he said, so it might not be exactly, but he said there are kind of four pillars of biblical truths: biblical sexuality, okay, the sanctity of life, taking care of the poor, and racial and gender equality. Those are, and he said, we live in a culture today where when it comes to Christians, a certain group of Christians have two favorites, and the other set of Christians have their two favorites. And he said, so evangelical churches tend to really like sanctity of life and biblical sexuality, but they ignore the other two. And then the more liberal churches, if you want to call them that, they love, racial equity and the whole thing about taking care of the poor. And his whole point was all four are important. So now when you talk about the next generation, I think the next generation are tuning into, at least evangelicals, they're tuning into those other two. And they're saying, these are important. And maybe my generation is kind of, no, they're not that important, when in fact, they are all equally important to God. And some of my research I did you mentioned my thesis, but there was a girl who, a young lady, sorry, Rachel Held Evans, who recently passed away. And she wrote something, if I can find it. People asked her, this is maybe 10 years ago, but they said, why are evangelical young people leaving the church? And she grew up in an evangelical church. And she said, because we want to ask questions, we want to doubt, we want to talk about tough and relevant topics. And a lot of times our leaders won't let us do that. And so I think when you talk about involving the next generation, I think that it's one thing to have events for, to have a vibrant ministry like you guys had. And, at your church where you guys were a really vibrant ministry. I know I would have called our ministry we had hundreds of kids come, and we went to 2 nights. Anyway, we had what you would have considered a vibrant young adult ministry. And I think young adult ministry is tough. I know we continue to really, our youth pastor, Matt, has done some really creative things with young adults, and they've been really successful. And we keep reaching out to young adults in our church. It is a tough age to get together, but here's the thing. I think more than program, it's attitude. I think if the young adults felt the church had an attitude of talking about it, like, no, let's, instead of trying to indoctrinate you, let's investigate it. And that, I think, is, I hope this is answering your question, Mike.
Totally.
I think it's an attitude.
Totally. I love what you said, Pastor Rob, that more importantly than programs, it matters people's attitude and really the leader's attitude. Are we open-minded to have conversations? I love what Andy Stanley said. Micah shared this quote with me that asking God a question is different than questioning God. And just having that distinction and not being afraid as a leader to recognize, I don't know everything. I want to grow in my knowledge, but I'm limited. And I have limits when it comes to education and knowledge and even, the questions that I've asked. And it's hard to lead people where you haven't been, or questions that you haven't been willing to confront. And we also like to ask, senior pastors of churches who come on Young Adults Today, why they believe that the faith of the next generation is vital, is important, like that it's important to pass on, to carry on for not only the survival of the church, but the saving of souls. Like, what would you say to that?
Well, I don't know where I heard this, but I heard someone recently said to their church where I don't know, it might have been, I have no idea, but somebody said to their church, we're just one generation away from losing our church. Okay. So I don't know the context of that. So I don't know exactly what that pastor meant. I don't even know who said it, but I can get it on the one hand. I get it on the other hand. I think that it's naive to say that if you're talking about Big C, because when you think about Big C Church for 2,000 years, we're not one generation away from losing the church. Please, we don't know church history. So it might have been talking about the denomination. We're one generation away from losing it. But you know what? If you think about churches, denominations rise and fall, and movements throughout the past 2,000 years. So I'm not sure we need to be that concerned about our particular movements. Doesn't mean we need to all be independents. I think there's great strength in being in groups that, you have common theology, you have accountability, you can do missions together. I mean, there's great strength in that. So I'm not saying that they're unimportant, but I think that I think what we have to be most concerned about is sharing an authentic faith. Let's not worry about the church. Let's share an authentic, real faith with the next generation and let the rest take care of itself. My daughter-in-law is a Lutheran pastor. Her dad's a pastor. She grew up in ELCA. She's an ELCA pastor. And a lot of people think, well, that's such a liberal denomination, et cetera, et cetera. She feels called to that denomination and all of that. But she told me a couple years ago, she said, I'm not sure my denomination is going to even exist by the time I end my career. And but again, I don't know that should be our biggest concern. So again, I'll stop there. But those are some thoughts.
That's huge, because I guess our passion, even with this podcast, is talking about reaching young adults in our world today and having conversations. And, really the emphasis of even that question is like talking about the faith of the next generation carrying on. We just feel like our burden is to see the next generation know and see and taste the goodness of God in the land of the living, and to see, our daughter come to know Jesus personally and to love his presence, to understand his word, and to be able to ask questions and understand and interpret life through the lens of Jesus. And so I agree that it's vital and important.
And I think it's also important to recognize that everybody is on their own personal faith journey, if you will say it that way. Like, everybody is trying to discover and uncover truth, and they're willing to look in places that are unfortunately feeding them not truth. And I think it's the church's job to rise up to those occasions and offer those spaces of questions that can be answered, to tackle the hard topics, and to not even always answer the question, but just pose the importance of maybe if it's a side or another side, or just the importance of the facts and the details versus the opinions and the feelings and emotions that get so wrapped up in that. So we know that we lead a lot of young adults who have left the church, who are looking for a church to get involved after they've maybe moved away from the state in which they were raised. They're,
Totally.
25 years old, they're like, I'm getting the heck out of here. And then 3-4 years later, they realize, wow, I moved down to Colorado or Texas or Arizona, and I didn't get plugged in with a church. I'm working 60 to 70 hours a week. I don't have a social life. I haven't met any friends. I'm going back home. And then they come back home, and maybe it's a church that they left. And they're
everything's
like,
different.
I don't know the leadership. That pastor's not there. I can still consider them my pastor. So it's like all these different tensions in the next generation. And I would say people maybe even in their mid to late 30s are experiencing this too, maybe more on a family level than an individual personal level if they're married and, in that season. But Pastor Rod, I remember stepping into your classroom at North Central University. You were the professor of this course. And for whatever reason, I remember going downstairs. It was a night class, I believe, on Monday nights. And I sat down and I thought it was a hermeneutics class. And here it's a homiletics class. And I'm like, am I in the right class? And I'm like, do I know the difference between homiletics and hermeneutics? And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I sat through it. I'm like, no, I'm enrolled in the right class. And I just remember you being a pastor and a professor, just being so transparent and faith-filled and level-headed when it came to the word of God, the will of God, and how to tackle hard questions. I mean, you had some individuals coming to your church with hidden agendas for wrong reasons to kind of ruffle the church's feathers in some way. And you brought us in, not detail by detail, but in a situation, in a scenario of like, I'm tackling things that I never thought I would ever have to deal with. And I think the cool part is that you also shared that you were willing to invite people to your church to critique your sermons. We live in a very critical world right now, and that is a very brave and bold move to make. I would like cry if I read some of the comments where I'd be like, you stand on your 1 foot too much, you put your hand in your pockets, you say a lot, you don't make good eye contact, whatever they could criticize. And I would just love for you just to share what made you choose that to be maybe the main portion of your dissertation. And can you share the story about having unchurched people come to your church to sit through a sermon and get to critique you, and then you get to read the feedback? Yeah.
So my thesis was called Preaching Effectively to the Unchurched. And by the way, if anyone's interested, I just looked at, if you just go Preaching Effectively to the Unchurched, Rod Carlson, it'll go to Luther Seminary. And if you're interested, you can download it. And it's 803 people have downloaded it since 2016. So
Amazing.
I'm an extremely popular person. But so I mentioned our vision for Oak Hills Church was the unchurched. And there are two things that I, thought about. One of the things that we did early on was like, we talked about like unchurched as if they were like this homogenized group. Like unchurched people think this way. They think A, B, C, D. And of course, all unchurched people are different. And then I'd never been unchurched. So why was I the expert? How could I talk about it? And so that was one thing. But then really then you're dealing with how do you preach if you want unchurched people to come? How do you preach to that group, especially if there are church people or longtime Christian people there? And so I began to think about my own preaching ability or skill, like how skillful am I at preaching, but then preaching in a way that unchurched people can understand. So as I mentioned earlier, our vision was, and I'm going to get to the specifics, Micah, but our vision was really hard. First of all, unchurched people, one of the things we learned, they don't want to come. The reason people don't come to church is they don't want to come to church. So we had this vision, we're going to reach unchurched people. None of them want to come. So that sounds easy, but it's really hard. And then, especially now, 30 years later, there are more people not attending church than there were 30 years ago.
Right.
That's the truth. There are more people today with less biblical knowledge, become biblically, ignorant, if you will, or illiterate. And And if they do come, then how do you reach them? So back to your question. So what I did, this is back in 2016. I had to do this specifically. What I did is I picked 3 sermons, and I'll just try to give you this really quick. I picked 3 sermons in the spring of 2016. We did, and we were going to have people evaluate it 3 ways. One, we asked our people to invite their unchurched friends to watch it online. So those 3 sermons, each time there were 45 different people who did it, but each time there were about 20 to 25 people who watched it online, filled out a survey. We found 12 people who actually would come to church those 3 Sundays, and they were unchurched. 4 of them were friends of ours, 2 were friends of my kids, and then people in our church. We just ask them if they would come. They came. I couldn't believe it. They came, they sat through the service, then they had lunch with me. And then we sat down with them, and they had filled out a little survey questions, and we just talked it through. Then the last part of the research, I asked 3 friends of mine to just do the same thing, but it was like one-on-one. Excuse me. So my physician, who's an unchurched guy, he came. My dentist, who's an unchurched guy. When you get older, you know these guys. So I asked them if they'd come. And then the third one was a barista that I knew for a long time at a coffee shop. Excuse me again. Anyway, so then I had these meetings where they just came, they listened, and afterward. And I had them fill out these surveys and these 7 questions. And it was amazing what I learned. And I don't know where you want me to go with that. I can talk about a few individual things. It was amazing to hear them talk about that sermon. I'll tell you. Well, you want me to give some story? What do you think would be helpful here?
Share a story. Like, what was a defining moment in that process, maybe for you and your character, or maybe that challenged your approach to be like, oh my gosh, like I've been missing the mark for 25 years of preaching to the unchurched.
Okay, so here's one. I mentioned I've never been unchurched. And, everybody talks about reaching the unchurched by watching your language. Don't use churchese or whatever we say. Okay, well, I get that. And that's true. You got to be, but it's much deeper than that. So first time we did this, 12 people sitting there. One of the questions was this: did the sermon encourage you to want to know more about having a relationship with Jesus? That's one of the questions. I had 12 people. You could say everything from yes, very much, to sort of, to not very much, to not at all. I went around to every person. How did you answer that? All 12, you guys, all 12. Not very much at all. Oh. This was the question. Did the sermon encourage you to want to know more about having a relationship with Jesus? All 12 of them chose the worst one, not at all. I mean, if you're not challenged with your preaching when that happens. So right. Then I said, okay, you guys, this is kind of the business I'm in. Help me out. So the discussion that followed was fascinating, but one struck me the most. It was a girl. I have a lot of coffee shop connections. Most of the unchurched people I've reached are people I've met in coffee shops. And these were 2 people that own a coffee shop, and they're friends of mine. Anyway, she said, Rod, you said personal relationship with Jesus. That makes me nervous. I don't even want that. I can't even imagine I don't get that. I remember her saying that she was unchurched. She grew up in a Catholic church, but she stopped going when she was very young. And I remember her honestly saying, I just, not only do I not understand that, I'm not sure I want that. And there were responses like that I was like, I am out of touch. And I could tell you, we had 3 of these sessions and learned a lot, but that's one example. That's just one.
That's so good. That's so good. It takes a adequate, humble leader to do what you did, to sit there and listen to the helpful critiquing or criticizing, but to know that our words as leaders and pastors or volunteers, if you're listening, our words carry weight, and how we present the gospel and our Christianese language. Maybe to us, that's everyday language, but to the non-Christian or the pre-believer or the person who maybe has a prodigal son story, they're not really there to sit there and interpret what you're saying. They're there because they're hungry and they're seeking truth on some level. Yep. And This is not scripted, but I've always had this question for individuals who are so designed and focused, and the call of your church is to reach the unchurched people and to get them through the door to encounter Christ, to get them plugged into a godly community. Pastor Rod, how do you, as a leader and as a pastor, not forget the believer sitting in the seats and in the congregation who may feel overlooked or under challenged, or maybe doesn't know how to use their spiritual gifts when, and I'm not just saying this is you, this is several people who have this vision to reach people outside of our four walls. How do you keep the current congregation engaged in their personal walk as well as following the vision that you have casted for almost 30 years?
Well, I'll tell you a recent story that I think will help. It's really difficult, to be honest. On the one hand, it's kind of difficult. On the other hand, it's not. So here's where I'm going to go. I'm going to go with the best preacher who ever lived, Jesus. Jesus, what did he do? He told a lot of stories. And the people who had been listening to the religious people, or at least thought they knew they didn't really want to listen to those religious people, were listening to him. And they were like, I have never heard anyone teach like this. I've never heard anyone with such authority. What did he do? He told stories. Mm-hmm. He gave these incredibly deep truths in a very simple way, if you will, but they were profound. So recently, and probably a lot of your listeners are part of churches, and because of what the last 12 months, I mean, we have had some sifting in our church, mm-hmm. and we're losing some folks. And in one in particular, I think we're losing some folks because I haven't in my preaching been, let's just call it, I haven't been read enough in my preaching. I haven't been political enough on that side. I think it's one of the reasons. And I think I won't talk about that because I think whatever pastors think they should do, I'm fine with that. I know where I felt like the Lord wanted us to go. So I have stayed more in the center and said, let's talk about the kingdom of God, you know. But I was talking to a good friend of mine. I'm talking to a good friend of mine. I was telling him about losing some of these folks. And I said, you know, I think that I have some people that have been a part of our church for so many years. Mm-hmm. And I try to design my preaching, whether I'm successful or not, I don't know, I'm sure trying, to have an unchurched person come in and hear it and be able to relate to it and go, okay, maybe I want to come back and hear this again. And so, but you know what, talking to my friend, I said, you know what, I think some of our people are like, I wish we could just have something more geared to a believer, you know, just give me something deeper and to a believer. And my friend who is an athlete said, you know what, Rod, some people just need to go to a home game. I don't know if this makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Some of our people have been at an away game for 30 years. Mm-hmm. For 30 years, they've been at an away game. And that's what I actually had called them to do. Mm-hmm. You got to go to an away game every weekend. And if you want a home game, you're probably going to have to get that to a certain degree, maybe in some of our classes or Wednesday nights, but the weekend's going to be an away game. And I don't even blame people. I think sometimes they're like, I got to go to a home game. Is this relating? Yeah. And I think so. And here's the last thing. I think that what I've just decided is I'm still going to keep doing this.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. I do think that even my preaching, you guys attend. So you guys, I think even my preaching does occasionally speak to the believer and cause them to grow, even though I'm attempting to make that palatable, if you will, to the unbeliever. So.
Right.
For sure. I love that. I love how you acknowledged the challenge of the tension that lies of deep and wide, and how do you format a message that's, like you said, palatable to the unbeliever and challenging to the person who is on their journey. And then there is also a simplicity of the gospel that it's like, easy enough and shallow enough for the beginner to walk in, and it's deep enough for the experienced swimmer, like the ocean, that there's waves that are out of control and beyond our deepest dreams or wildest reach. And so I just think that one of the things that it stood out to me is almost looking at a business term of like leadership with focus groups. Because it's one thing that you said to like say, well, I'm the expert, I'm preaching to the unchurched, but then to never talk to a person who's unchurched and ask them questions. So I love the local contextualized ministry that was a demonstration of Eagan, Minnesota. And again, like Micah said, a secure leader to say, you know what, I'm going to be vulnerable for a second as a leader, but I think that vulnerability is so valuable.
Right.
If you're wanting to find out not just what you think or is on your heart or the Lord speaking to you, but is this resonating to the people that we're attempting to reach? And I think the other thing, Pastor Rod, that stood out is unchurched people are all over the map.
Yeah.
It's like Jesus described these different types of soil, and there's a lot of different types of soil out there. And sometimes people will really surprise you that jump on board that you would have said, I would have never guessed that they'd even come to church. And now they're just like all in.
Fire, yeah.
Yeah. And then some people that you're like, they're like the nicest person. They're basically behaving like a Christian, and they're like, I want nothing to do with it. And so I think like this idea of where people's heart posture is, or hunger level, or Jesus called it their soil, that's huge. But is there anything else that you would share, maybe for the person who is young as a leader, who is trying to become better and more effective as a communicator, even specifically as it pertains to reaching the unchurched on their college campus, or the unchurched in their local community, or within the powerful vehicle of the local church?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about preaching first, and then I'll just talk maybe just on the campus if you're speaking in a Chi Alpha meeting or whatever.
Yes, exactly.
This is just a principle that, back to my friend who's an athlete, he's a great golfer, and he turned 55 about 4 years ago, and he could go on senior tour, and he'd always wanted to go on the tour. He's actually getting close to get on the senior tour, but he's an excellent golfer. But at 55, a great golfer, he hired a coach. She watched him swing for about 45 minutes. They had a meeting in the clubhouse. She said, his name's Chip. Chip, I can help you, but you're gonna have to change your swing, and you're gonna get worse before you get better. So he said, okay, help me change my swing. So here's the thing. The guy was a great golfer already. And you know what? I started preaching young, and I thought I was a pretty good preacher. Today I think I won't talk about how good or bad I think I am. It doesn't matter. I just started early. I had some encouragement. I cut to thinking I was a pretty good preacher. And you know what? 25 years later, I developed a swing. And you do pretty good. You get a pretty good score. Now you can stay there, or you can go, you know what? I should hire a coach. And maybe my coaches there were like unchurched people. I should hire a coach because I got to change my swing. And if you play pretty good, you can go the rest of your life. But so I think we always got to consider changing our swing. Even me, like right now, I'm 64. I already mentioned like 3 times. Okay, so I want to change my swing again. Right now, I want to change my swing again because things are changing so fast. And I think to younger leaders, I'd say be open to always doing that. I'd also say, one of the things that I found, and it's still true today, and especially with young adults, everybody knows this, but I'm just going to say, in the research, in response to people to my preaching, one of the things that emerged is that they respond well to authenticity. You can't fake that. And kids pick it up. Young adults especially pick it up.
Yep.
And so there's this fake authenticity that they can also pick up on. You just got to be real. And if they sense you're real and you don't have another motive and you're not trying to manipulate them and you're not trying to hype something, that you have an audience immediately with young adults today. And of course, now we're talking millennials to Gen Z, because Gen Z is our new young adults. I mean, that higher end there is what you guys are trying to reach. So those are a couple of thoughts on that.
Great. Thank you for going there. And Pastor Rod, we are ready for you to be real and authentic with us, because we've reached one of our favorite parts of the conversation, more or less. So we have our final thoughts. It's called 5 and 5.
Yeah.
So 5 questions in 5 minutes. Do you think you're up for the challenge?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. You ready? Question number 1. If you could describe your soul right now in this season, what 3 words would you use to describe it?
Okay. Right now, in this moment, there are 3 words. They all start with R. Repentance, reimagine, reset.
Awesome.
I like that. When you said reimagine, I thought of like Disney and Pixar and just the ability to visually reimagine the future. It's powerful. How about, I know you're a reader. Every time I talk to you, you're reading a different book, you're studying God's word, and words mean something to you. I know they do. Are there any words that you hold closely to your heart? It could be a quote, scripture, anything. Are there words that you live by, Pastor Rod?
You mentioned books. My favorite book lately is by Jerry Seinfeld, Is This Anything? But anyway, I would say the word right now is grace. I'll just leave it at that. My mom's name was, she passed away, Gracie. I think grace is one of the best, greatest words.
That's wonderful. All right. And question number 3, we know that you are a huge sports fanatic. For those of you who know him, that's probably not very true, but here is a curveball for you, Pastor Rod.
Oh boy, it wasn't in the notes.
It wasn't in the notes.
Oh boy.
If you could ask us one question today, what would you ask us?
If I could ask you 2 one question.
Yeah.
This keeps us on our toes.
How's parenthood? How you getting along with that beautiful little girl?
Want to go?
Yeah, daddy powers are activating. I love her. Aurora, our daughter, she's like 9 months old tomorrow at the time of recording this episode. She's a sweetheart. She has 7 teeth that have popped through. She's standing. She has emotions. She and I are buddies. I say this thing, I go, buddy, and I hold out my pointer finger and she raises her pointer finger and we touch like E.T. Phone Home. She waves at me. I say things like, Daddy's home. And she smiles, she giggles. I asked Micah, I was like, who makes her laugh more than anyone? And
you've seen his dance moves, you would laugh too. So she lost it. She got the hiccups. She was laughing so hard.
So I love her so much. It's really a privilege and a joy to be her dad.
Yeah, I think parenting has been a significant just shift in like prioritizing who are we in ministry, who are we in marriage, who are we now as a family. And it's been a beautiful journey. It's been challenging at times. I think COVID for us, I think, was a beautiful season in disguise to understand, how important it is for us to be, solely rooted in Christ as individuals. And I say this every time somebody asks, but what's her name? Pastor Lorelai would say this. She's like, if you want to learn how to be selfless, get married. If you want to be more like Christ, have children. And I think that's what we're learning, is how to be more like Christ, extending grace to each other, extending, all those different things to each other. So parenthood has been amazing with her. She loves to play, giggle, laugh. Oh my gosh. I think she just got over the roseola, whatever that is.
Rosie O'Donnell's disease.
That's what he calls it. You can never remember the name. I think she cried more in the one day than she has her whole life because of a fever and just her rash and everything. So she's a sweetheart though. She is a go-getter. I think she's very tenacious, if I could describe her, and adventurous.
I was listening to Andy Stanley share about parenting in the 21st century and parenting in a pandemic. And he said that he just described he's like, well, here's the goal of parenting, to get your child from the car seat to the driver's seat. And I had this flashback of not knowing how to put the car seat in the car, and they send us home from the hospital and they won't touch our car because it's the very beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm YouTubing this. I don't know how to get the car seat in.
Wow.
She came a couple weeks early, and I'm like, I don't know how to drive as a parent. And so all the emotions are very real.
Oh my word.
You know what? I really enjoyed hearing you two talk about that. I really
If
did.
there's any moment of panic, I'm the calm, cool, collected one. He's the frantic one. Just so everybody knows, who do you want there? Josiah will alert you that something's wrong. I will walk you through the process and help you survive.
We're a good team. We're a good team.
Oh
She's
my
a great
gosh.
teammate. But back to you, Pastor Rod. Would
Yeah.
you maybe be willing to share about any mistake that you feel like you've made in life, ministry, leadership, and maybe what God taught you through the process?
Yeah, of course. So many mistakes, hard to pick one. I just thought I'd get it into one mistake that we all tend to make, and that is comparison. And so I think that I would, here's the thing. Don't make the mistake of comparing all the time. Just complete what God is called you to do. And we have a verse that we have at Oak Hills Church, Philippians 1:6. He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. And so that is a mistake I think we all make. So I'd say, don't make that mistake. Quit comparing.
That's
Wow.
great. That's great.
Yeah.
All right. The last and final thought we have for you. Question number 5. If you could tell a group of college pastors and young adult ministry leaders one thing, what would you leave them with today?
I would quote one of our most brilliant theologians in recent history. He recently died. His name, maybe you're familiar with it, Fred Rogers.
Yes, America's children's pastor.
Wow.
There are 3 ways to ultimate success. The first way is to be kind. The second way is to be kind. The third way is to be kind.
Oh my gosh. Pastor Rod, that means something to me significant in our world today, because everyone needs kindness. Everyone, the word you mentioned before, grace. Everyone needs grace. We ourselves are so undeserving of grace, and we've been given it freely. And we were in no way deserving of kindness, and yet it's been displayed to us.
Right.
And if you look at it, Jesus said that people are going to know, outsiders are going to know that you are my disciples. You follow me. You know me in the way that you love each other, treat each other with kindness. And man, you talk about a fruit of the Spirit that maybe gets brushed to the side or overlooked too much. Thank you for your kindness to us in so many ways, for the kindness to the listener today, for tuning in, and just for a great conversation today, Pastor Rod.
Yeah, you're welcome. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
And guys, once again, if you can find out more about Pastor Rod Carlson, Oak Hills Church, and we will link to the Luther Seminary website that has his essay on preaching effectively to the unchurched. If that's something you'd like to read more about, when you connect with us on our show notes and website at youngadults.today. Until next time, this is Josiah and Micah Canary. Thanks for tuning in.